The Nigerian power grid has recorded a total of 8 collapses. That's in total this year, from January to June. That's in 6 months. The development has affected consumers across the country. The grid suffered 4 total collapses. That's in January and one each in February, April, and May. The power supply situation in Nigeria is getting worse by the day. Rather than more light, well, we say it's more darkness enveloping the country. Data from the Ministry of Power, Works and Housing indicates that the national grid collapsed twice last week, worse than electricity supply in many parts of the country. Now, the pictures there are those of artisans that have to go out of their way to actually use generators and all of that to run their businesses. You know, they have to go out of their way to do all of this, and it's affecting profit and also running costs of their various businesses. The total power generation, which figures stands at 4,372 megawatts. As of today, it's actually fluctuating. It's neither here nor there. Now, to discuss this critically and put it into proper context, a public policy analyst, Michael Oluwagbemi, is joining me live from Abuja studios. It's great to have you join us again, Mr. Oluwagbemi.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Good afternoon.
Yes, I want to start this way. I won't say it's one too many. We are back to this discussion again. Grid collapse. Now, the transmission company of Nigeria is blaming the discos for not taking power. In your thoughts, what is responsible for this continuous, ugly exercise?
Yeah, I mean, the system collapse, I believe, was the 8th one this year, and we're just about the middle of the year. As you have mentioned, we had a total of 12 last year. So we are easily on track for anything from 16 to 20 this year if it continues at the same pace. The particular issue that happened in this instance happened within the Abuja disco level, where a reactor at the switchyard station actually got burned. And as a result of that, that led to system imbalances that eventually led to system collapse about 48 hours ago. And it took, I believe, almost 13 to 14 hours for power to then be restored across the system. Bulk power to be restored across the system. Naturally, the blame game starts almost immediately after any system collapse. But again, we need to interrogate this beyond the blame game. I said on this program before, and I will say it again, that the issues affecting this power sector, the issue affecting the grid, are systemic, and they can be tackled if we put our minds to it and we focus on the core areas which I highlighted at the last instance. First and foremost is and will always remain the liquidity of the system that can only be guaranteed by discos being able to collect all the money they are supposed to collect at the distribution level. If you do not pay your power bill, and if the cost of power is not recovered, then it will be impossible to invest in the grid. The second thing that which the ability to do that will only be possible when you have achieved 100% metering. There's no reason why any disco in Nigeria today is not fully compliant in terms of metering all their customers so that we can get liquidity back into the system. Once that is achieved, then discos can then go about investing in their infrastructure. As of today, there's little or no investment in the infrastructure because a lot of the discos are in debt to their neck. They are owing the federal government, they are owing banks. They barely are able to service their debt, and they're even taking money out of the system by paying their managers and management ridiculous sums of money. So even in a scenario where they are not collecting enough, they continue to spend too much on things that do not impact their customers. So it is very important that the NERC steps up the regulation, as I indicated the last time, of discos, and ensure that discos invest in their network. To do that, either we have some kind of recapitalization round that requires disco to be recapitalized to a certain level so that they can be able to afford capital reinvestment in the infrastructure, in the downstream. Because without those investments in the infrastructure in the downstream, the kind of fire incident we had in Abuja Disco will continue to happen. And without the liquidity, they will not be able to invest in their own infrastructure. And lastly is what I just highlighted, that the NERC needs to ensure much more tighter regulation regime. I think the regulation regime today is too, in fact, I would say it's too lax. We understand TCN indicated that one of the discos was cut off completely from the grid, was suspended from the grid, and is on track to be completely dismissed. And 2 others are already on notice, I believe, Eco Disco and another one. I think it's high time that the NERC does its job. The NERC needs to read the riot act to these discos, and it needs to go through a recapitalization process of the entire value chain. That said, all of this needs to be put in the context of ensuring that the system is liquid and investments can happen in the system. And the only way to achieve this, we've already said, it has to be regulatory driven, and this is what we need for Nigerians to get power.
Let's take
Short-term
point. Mr. Michael, let's take it from the point where you say
yes,
it has to be regulatory driven. I want us to look back before we move on in this discussion, a little bit back to privatization process. That's about 2015. Now, there were a lot of accusations at that time that most of the companies that bought into these assets had little or no idea of what they were coming into. They thought it was going to be like the telecom sector. And there was also an allegation in some quarters that these assets were handed over to some cronies of government at that time. Now, let's evaluate that process. How well do you think that privatization process went on in Nigeria?
The taste of the pudding is in the eating. The reality is that the fact that we do not have power more than almost 5 years after the privatization is an indication that the process was bungled. There's only one answer. That's the only answer I can give to you. The people that bought the asset had no business buying the asset in the first place. Most of them had zero experience in terms of running such assets at the level of complexity that we all know the power sector is. Number 2, the format, the design of the privatization process was very, very, very wrong. More recently, we had a former commissioner, 2 former commissioners actually go at themselves on social media, where they were blaming one another for the various tampering and politicization of that process. We saw that play out in the public. I think it's high time that the National Assembly should review the privatization process by calling a public hearing and asking those 2 characters who were on social media, that is Twitter, going after each other saying, oh, you were wrong, you were the one that was to be blamed, where we, the Nigerian people, are the ones suffering the consequences of their actions or misactions. The other fact also remained that there was a lot of corruption that was associated with the privatization project. We had people buying 2 or 3 discos, different kind of SPVs that were formed, that were fronting for other people. The reality is that until we get to the bottom of that privatization process, then Nigeria will not be able to untangle the problem that we find ourselves today. We live with the consequences of the corruption of the past, and that corruption extended all the way to the power sector. And the fact and reality remains that the process that produced the current privatized ownership of certain segments of the power sector was bungled. And it's high time that the government goes back into it and looks into it and reveals all the shady characters and shady individuals that were behind it, and also punish those that needs to be punished. And where assets needs to be recovered, it should be recovered. The fact already remains that it is already on paper that these folks that bought the asset had some contractual obligation. A number of those contractual obligations has already been violated. So why are we still insisting on keeping folks that have no capacity, that have no funding, that also actually obtain these assets illegitimately to hold the Nigerian people and the Nigerian economy to hostage? For every 1,000 megawatts of depletion in the grid, Nigeria loses billions of dollars. And yet we continue to insist that we're going to keep these guys under contract. There's no reason, we have no legitimate reason, both moral, legal, or otherwise, to continue to have these guys responsible for distribution of power in Nigeria. It is high time the government takes this serious. The government owns 40%, the BPE owns 40% of all of these distribution assets. As a 40% owner, it can demand for a board meeting, it can demand for a review of the operation. The fact also remains that these discos also owe the CBN billions of naira. The CBN can call those, and when they call those, AMCON can take possession of shares of the company, and essentially those companies will revert back to 100% ownership of the federal government of Nigeria. And then we can restart the privatization process. I personally think the Indian model that was undertaken for the privatization of the power sector was a wrong one. What we should have done was a system that actually allowed anybody that's investing in generation to see through all the way to the customer so that they can recover their money. And then you'll not have any of these problems. And we'll have a system where we have multiple grids that are interconnected. That is the model that will work. The model that was undertaken in 2015, aside from it being wrong from a technical point of view, was wrong from a market point of view. And ultimately, was also wrong from the point of view of morality and legality.
Let's go to the distribution chain, the distribution end of it that has the direct link with the consumer. And we know the argument of distribution companies for some time has been they want cost-reflective tariff. But Nigerians are saying that we don't even get power. How do we pay for what we don't get? That's also the argument for metering. They are saying they can't buy meters, they can't provide meters for customers. So all comes down to the liquidity issue again. So with what we have on ground, how can we shore up liquidity for these discos so that at least they can invest back into whatever agreement they have with government and let us have light? That's the most important thing. Electricity is what Nigerians want.
Look, the first thing first is the folks that are in charge of running the discos, do they even know the business that they are in? Because when I hear them make arguments about cost-reflective tax, in the same vein, when we tell them, go and install meters and partner with people that have meters in order to recover your current tariff, they then back off and say they don't want to do that. If you think your current tariff does not allow you to fully recover your cost, by the cost, I don't even understand what they mean by cost, because by the way, they get power essentially free from MBET or from Gencos or TCN, and then they are supposed to recover the money and then pay the money back in a certain ratio. So if we are talking about cost, most of their own costs are actually overhead because most of the infrastructure that they rely on is already on ground. All they need to do is certain upgrades at certain parts of that value chain. But if they are talking about cost-reflective tariff, collect the tariff that is already owed you today 100%. Most of them claim anything from 25% to 52% collection. So if you are losing half of the money that you are supposed to be collecting today, is the first step not to recover what you are supposed to be collecting today by ensuring 100% metering. But for some reason, the current discos, they like the regime of blame game. They do not want to recover the money they hold out there by consumers and by customers. They insist on not metering and continue to go down the route of estimated billing. They are the only regulated operator in the country today that seems to exist on government largesse despite being privatized. So we as a country need to interrogate this issue carefully and to ask one simple question only. Ensure 100% metering. There are meter companies today that have come forward to the discos and said, look, we will work with you. We will install meters for free. And what we do is we collect just a tiny part of the bill every month to recover the cost of meters. This is a solution that any distribution company should jump at. But for some reason, the distribution companies in Nigeria are still not interested. Why is that? That tells me that there's some secret to the business model. And I think the only way we can ensure we recover the process is first and foremost to insist on 100% metering, to ban estimated billing, and also to ensure that the discos are properly run.
Finally,
discos that do not have liquidity, they need to be recapitalized. Discos that do not have liquidity, cannot do day-to-day business, cannot invest in their infrastructure, have no business being discos.
Mr. Michael, on the final note now, we've talked about what the discos need to do. We highlighted all of that. Now as we round up, the consumer also has a role to play in all of this. Let's be frank with ourselves.
Absolutely.
Energy theft. People bypass meters. A lot of sharp practices by users, consumers of electricity. And it's a normal thing because people still have the mindset of the old Nigerian Electric Power Authority, PHCN, and all of that. Don't know that this is now run by a private entity. What do you make of that?
Yes. It's very important that every state in Nigeria, every state governor in Nigeria sees that electricity is their #1 responsibility. I have to start with that. You see, our governors sometimes also shirk their responsibility. Under the law of Nigeria today, the state governors have responsibility for the economy of their state. And if power is very important and intrinsic to the economy of your state, then you have to take the issue of power theft and recovery of power, the power cost in your state very important. There are a few governors that have actually done the right thing. Under the previous governor in Lagos, Governor Ambode, he had actually pushed the power theft law. And to some extent, it was already on the path to recovery before the political season. In the case of Kebbi, I know, for example, that the governor had actually given and delegated a task of collecting fees that are due to power companies to district heads who were able to collect these power fees based on the meter that was put on distribution transformers. So what they did was, any transformer that came and brought power to this area had a certain power allocated to it. It didn't matter to the governor of the state. All he wanted was district heads were responsible for collecting the power that came to their transformers. And suddenly they had 80-90% recovery. Why can't this be done on a national basis? Why can't our governors take responsibilities? Why can't our state house assemblies actually start taking responsibilities for this particular issue? If they actually pass power theft law, stealing at the end of the day is not a federal crime, it's a state crime. So every state in Nigeria have a duty, every state governor, as chief law enforcement officer of their state, have a duty to pass the power theft law in their states, have a duty to ensure that there's some level of enforcement, have a duty to ensure that there's a level of cooperation and recovery with discos who are interested in cooperating with them. Until we Nigerians understand that we run a federal republic where state governors have primary responsibility for the economy, and the citizens also have primary responsibility to obey the law. And the enforcement has to be done by the Ministry of Justice across the states. They need to have the prosecutors prosecute citizens, industrial and as well as residential customers, for power theft, for bypassing meters, in order to ensure that we all have power. Then we will not be on the path to success and recovery. So I think this is important. The National Economic Council, led by the Vice President, I hope, should step up the game and insist that every state in Nigeria should have a power theft law. The police should be brought into the issue. EFCC should be brought into the issue, because this is an economic and financial crime. And I think this should be taken more seriously.
Public policy analyst there, Michael Olugbemi. Beautiful and great analysis as usual. Thank you very much for joining us on the show.